This edition of the AMC Premium Podcast is brought to you by the National Motor Racing Museum, located at Murray's Corner, Mount Panorama, Bathurst, New South Wales. For more information, visit www.museumsbathurst.com.au.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very unusual episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine's podcast series because we have, I think for the first time ever, all three editors of the magazine together. We have Mark Oastler, the founding editor. We have Luke West, who followed Mark, and we have Steve Normoyle, who is the current editor. Now, this I don't think has been recorded or even conversed previously. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
Yes, we have Luke and Steve in the studio with us, and Mark's on the telephone because he is living in Melbourne these days. So between the three of these guys, they're all extremely talented, extremely experienced. They've been there, done that. Between them, as journalists, they envisaged the magazine. They created the magazine. We launched the magazine. They have fostered its growth through the following years, and they continue to be involved in the quite a unique Australian motor racing publishing success, which is Australian Muscle Car Magazine. Now, the way we're going to format this today is that I'll talk to each of them in order chronologically, but the other two are welcome to butt in, correct, change, alter, deny, whatever they think is a fair thing to do as the conversation rolls on, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of denial. So, starting with Mr. Mark Oastler, founding editor.
Thank you.
From a chronological point of view, we should start with you. Please let us know what your memory tells you of how it all started, and we'll see if my memory actually remembers the same thing, which is highly unlikely. Mark, over to you.
The older we get, the better we were, eh, Bergie?
Oh, the older we get, the faster we were.
Look, I would have to say the foundations laid for this magazine were many, many years before it even started. Because as a lifelong motorsport enthusiast and a love of high-performance cars, which in Australian vernacular was muscle cars, I grew up with all of these stories whirling around things like the supercar scare, the mysterious Phase 4 GTHO, the XU1 V8, the Bill Bourke special, the Super Falcons, V8 RT Chargers. All of these stories were buzzing and buzzing around in my head, and I could never find any solid historical information, solid research to explain what they were all about, sort the fact from fiction, the urban myths, and that sort of stuff. And as I grew older, I grew increasingly frustrated with that situation. So that's one thing. I was fascinated by the history of the sport that I loved. That's one element to it. The other element to it was when I was commentating on V8 supercars toward the end of the 90s into the 2000s, a period of, you might remember, of great dominance by Holden Racing Team. I found that when I was going to V8 supercar rounds, they were quite often supported by historic Group NC touring cars, which was that era from 65 to 72. And every time these cars came out on the track, I just found myself walking out of the commentary box, standing beside the track, and just going, wow, look at these things. How good is this? Like late 1960s, early 70s muscle cars, Camaros, Mustangs, XY GT Falcons, HQ Monaros, these big thundering V8 Aussie sedans on these big bulbous tyres, rock and rolling around, power sliding out of the corners, real attitude on the cars. And I'm just looking at this thinking, now, this stuff is really, really absorbing. Like I'm more into this than I am to the supercars. That's when I started to think, maybe I should be in a different line of work here. And so my interest in the idea of exploring this rich heritage, this incredibly rich heritage that we had, it was really worth exploring. And I became more and more passionate about the idea. And then I remember while this stuff was buzzing around in my head, Ray and I just had an impromptu meeting in the pit lane at Oran Park, one of the V8 Supercar rounds. I think it must have been 2000. And there was a bit of a pause in proceedings. I don't know what the delay was there, Bergie, but there was a bit of a downtime, and we just started to struck up this conversation in pit lane.
I might add that the downtime was all of about, 3 or 4 days, I think it was.
Yeah. But we started up this conversation, and I mentioned to being well aware of the fantastic photo archive that Chevron Publishing had at the time, putting two and two together. I said, look, I've got an idea for a magazine, and I'd like to come and put it to you and Tom Floyd, your business partner at the time, and see what you think. And then, to cut a very long story short, obvious name of the format, and the magazine was born.
It's a funny thing. I have clear memory of that day at Oran Park. It was on a Saturday afternoon in between practice sessions. It was pelting down rain. We were hiding in Tony Perrich's new pit garage that he built. He built especially for about 2 or 3 years of racing, and then he very cleverly built the whole structure in a prefab sense, so that once they'd built it, they could actually unbolt it and pull it down and remove it, because he was in the process of turning Oran Park into a suburb.
Correct.
But it's interesting how when two people have a parallel set of ideas, that you can actually achieve an awful lot by being involved in the same planning process.
It's really interesting to hear the two actual founders of the magazine talk about how the magazine got underway, and the stories match, because over the years that I was in the editor's chair, I must have heard from, I wish I had $1 for everyone who said to me, it was my idea for the Australian Muscle Car magazine that I mentioned to Mark Oastler. So it's great to hear the actual story.
Well, that's true, because as Mark said earlier, quite honestly, it's an idea which was so blatant obvious, but we were the only two silly buggers that put our heads up and thought, we can actually do this. And I sat down with my business partner at the time, Tom Floyd, and I said, this is how much it's going to cost. This is how much we have to earn out of it to make it profitable. Do we think we can do this? Because I knew that Mark could produce a magazine. I just didn't know whether or not we could actually make it an economic success. And that's where really the time bomb started ticking from that moment onwards.
Yeah. Well, look, and obviously there was a fair bit of pressure on, because to come to you guys and say, to get you to outlay a considerable sum to get that magazine off and running, I had to be reasonably confident within myself, based on my industry experience, historic knowledge and what have you, to be able to say, hey guys, this is going to fly. It will work. And I must admit, it was funny. I remember in that first meeting when I presented the idea to Ray, and particularly to Tom, who hadn't sort of been across it, he was pretty cold on the idea. He really wasn't that enthusiastic about it at all. And I must say, thanks to my good old colleague, Steve Normoyle, because, I remember in that meeting, he was a critical voice in getting that thing across the line. He was explaining to Tom how it differed from existing Chevron material, how it would set a new benchmark, and how it would do a lot of things quite innovative in the industry. And I always thank you, Steve, for going into bat for us at that meeting, mate, because it might have been difficult without you there.
No, that's all right, Mark. I felt pretty dumb after you came in, because I saw you laid out what the proposal was, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, yes, I get that. And it was something a little bit similar to what I'd been thinking about, without really putting it together as a tangible idea for the Bathurst magazines that we just started doing. And I thought there's got to be something that we can do with the history, certainly going right back to the late 60s and early 70s of what you were talking about before with the great cars and all of that stuff, which is really where what we have today and what we had then in touring car racing was all founded. But as soon as I saw you, because I think you had the first 5 years planned out, and
it or something like that.
I might add that we started off producing the magazine as a quarterly, so we produced, the theory was 4 issues a year, and we were going to then decide where it took us from that point after a year of publishing. Now, I'm butting in on Steve here for a moment, but the way it worked was quite dramatic in the sense that we figured we set up a certain economic equation that the magazine had to achieve, and we worked for months to, as you do, you have to work months and months and months in advance of publishing anything, and you have to have enough financial backing to ensure that you can produce at least 3 issues before you guarantee any income. So we were quite surprised when the first issue was finally produced and went on sale, and the preliminary figures we got from our distributor were something in the region of 3 times higher sale figure than we expected to get at the end of production for that first issue. And we were sitting there looking at this sheet of numbers thinking, where the hell did that come from?
It was a rollicking success. I thought it would work from the beginning, which is easy for me to say because it wasn't my money. But yeah, I mean, there was the Ray and Tom were a bit gun shy to begin with. I think Ray thought it was a bit too much like Street Machine, and Tom thought it was a hot rod magazine initially. But I think that's the point, because it sort of what you created was a subgenre, which was something that didn't exist. So you kind of went between 2 cracks or several cracks into a market that was there, but no one was tapping. So yeah, I guess it was initially difficult for our publisher here and others to see what it was. But yeah, once it was out there.
It's interesting that you say that, Steve, because I've had an interesting sort of motto for years that when people say, when people produce something new and they say to the creator, "Oh, you found a hole in the market." Well, my analysis is there are no holes in the market. You create a hole in the market by producing something that doesn't exist. The analysis I have, or the example, is that when NASA created a product called Teflon, they weren't thinking about putting it on frying pans, but it worked out that it worked on frying pans. Now, when you produce a new magazine that doesn't exist and the topic is not being covered, it creates its own place in the market. There are no holes before that.
Yeah. And the funniest thing was, I remember the constant comment I got, and Bergie would have heard this, Steve, I'm sure. Oh, nice magazine, guys, but you're going to run out of material in about 10 issues, aren't you? And I used to say to everyone, coming out the standard line, I said, guys, I'm not worried about running out of material. What I'm really worried about is running out of time to present all of the material. And they'd go, oh.
Exactly.
And then by the time we got to about issue 25 or 30, they started to go, oh, okay, right. And it was great, because it was like, I just felt like you were educating the market, because the skepticism that we struck early on about, you're going to run out of material, the vast majority of people's knowledge of muscle car heritage, muscle car history, was Falcon GTHO, RT Charger, Tirana. That was basically it. There was just no understanding of the depth and the multiple layers of not only the competition side of things, but how that competition program is linked to road cars, and how incredibly clever our little car industry was. A tiny population, a dot on the map. The fact that we were able to produce all of these wonderful high-performance muscle cars, which not only performed on the street but also performed on the racetrack. It's a really, really unique story, and it's so multi-layered that I knew it could just keep going and going and going. So
it comes back.
It was so satisfying to get it into print.
It comes back to that old sort of, I suppose, almost marketing statement. Race on Sunday, sell on Monday.
Sell on Monday. Yeah. exactly.
Because when you think all three manufacturers, Holden, Ford and Chrysler, were intent on building road-going race cars so that they could sell that motor car to the public.
Yeah. But it's the scale that blows me away, Bergie. Our car industry was so small on a global scale, yet we were able to do all of that within this small market. I just find it extraordinary what this country achieved at that time. It's amazing.
So, look, you were editor of the magazine for the first 53 issues, which is quite a long time. And there's got to be some sort of high points and low points. I can remember one of the more interesting low points was the issue that you decided to produce with a Holden off-road vehicle on the front cover.
Yes. Well, I mean, I knew that was going to be a oncer, and I knew it was going to be controversial, which I love controversy anyway. But I also knew it was this great Australian motor industry story that just had to be told, simply because no one else would have dared to do such a thing. So, look, it was effective. It was an amazing story, really. Arthur Hayward, this guy in Tasmania who wanted to build these cars as like an Australian version of like a Chevy Blazer or whatever from the US. So he added the four-wheel drive equipment, and the fact that he got agreement from GMH to say, we'll provide warranty for the vehicle if you provide warranty for all the four-wheel drive equipment you put on. I mean, that's an extraordinary arrangement with a company as big as General Motors Holden, but he did it, and he pioneered, I guess, what I saw as Australia's first Holden special vehicle in a different context. So, and I think the readership too was split either way. Like some loved it, some hated it, but I thought it was important. I didn't mind the controversy, but I thought it was important to show AMC's depth of knowledge beyond just a strictly road and race focus. I wanted to test the readership and see how far they would go in all these different directions. So it was interesting from an editorial viewpoint, and I don't regret it, even though it was one of the weaker selling issues.
So on that same sort of topic, I have three memories of editions that you produced which were stellar in in the relationship to what the market had seen before in this editorial context. The first one of those, of course, was the feature on Bill Bourke's black Falcon GTHO. And then probably my favourite was that 32-page long feature on the Falcon GTHO. That has to be the longest story on one motor car ever published in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Bill Bourke special, issue 14, that's, there's so many great stories that we tackled there and drilled into and were able to tell in some depth. But Bill Bourke special I put that up as my high point, I think, as editor. And the reason why I say that, again, the Bill Bourke special was one of those cars that I grew up with as a kid, saying, who built this? Where was it built? Who designed it? Like, there was never any article saying where this vehicle came from. It was just Bill Bourke's company car. So when I got into the chair at AMC, I started ringing around. I want to do a story on this car, but where do I get the background? I rang John Wynn at Ford Special Vehicles. No, I don't know who built that. Colin Russell, Ford Special Vehicles. No, don't know anything about it. Peter Gillitzer, Wayne Draper in design. I went through all the Broadmeadows and said, does anyone know who built this car? And no one had any recollection of how it was built. And I thought, well, my last roll of the dice is I've got to find Bill Bourke. And I didn't even know if he was still alive. But then I had to go into this in-depth detective work, contacting the US and working through the telephone operator there, who was very helpful. Tracked down one William O. Bourke. And I said, that's got to be him. That has to be him. Can you please put me in touch with him? So they made the connection. It was Bill Bourke. He wasn't very well at that stage, but his nurse asked him, and he agreed to have a chat to me about this car.
Can I interrupt for just a second? Mark, I want to, first of all, for those who probably don't have the same length of memory that you and I do, please explain who was Bill Bourke and why was this important?
Sure. Bill Bourke was the managing director of Ford Australia from about 1966, I think, to 1972, 73. And in that time, he really, really shook up Ford Australia. You know, he was the father of the Falcon GT program. He brought in Al Turner from the United States to run the Ford Special Vehicles division, which developed the HO handling option, as they called it, for the GT, the competition program. He just injected so much excitement and energy into the Ford Motor Company and set it on its path toward knocking off Holden for market leadership. So he was, without doubt, when you look at the history of Ford Australia, he was by far the most charismatic, the most dynamic managing director they've ever had. So, you know, people kissed the ground that Bill Bourke walked on. He was known, when he was manager, to be driving around in this mysterious black XWGT Falcon with a gigantic 7-litre 428 Cobra jet engine in it and a whole lot of Mustang accessories and goodness knows what else. Very unusual car. And I couldn't find, where was it built? Where's the history? There was no history for it. So getting back to tracking him down in the US, he wasn't very well at that stage, but his nurse agreed to allow him to talk to me briefly about this car. Now, the interview was only supposed to take about 5 or 10 minutes. I could hear with his coughing and his wheezing and stuff, he wasn't very well. And I thought, I've just got to get this information out of him. You know, who built this car? Anyway, he comes on, and that wonderful charm of all, you know, Bill Bourke, it was still there, even though he wasn't well. It was just classic Bill Bourke. And I said, I want to talk to you about this car. Oh, yeah. I'd like that. Anyway, this interview was supposed to take 10 minutes. We ended up talking for 45. And this was like midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning here when I was talking to him. And he just gave me the full story. It's just amazing. Like, this car was shipped over to the US. The Ford Australia was visited by Bunky Knudsen, who just become manager of Ford in the US. And he said, you're doing such a great job over here. I want to build you a special company car. So they shipped an XWGT over to the US. Under Knudsen, this car was built just for Bill Bourke and shipped back. Now, until I did that interview, no one knew anything about that car's history. So that, to me, as a journalist and as an editor, was the most satisfying story I could have done. It just stands out as a highlight because that was breaking something that no one ever knew anything about beforehand, which was, it's fantastic.
It just sort of goes to show all of those guys you talked about before who you asked about the history of the car, it never ran down the production line at Broadmeadows, did it?
That's it. And that's why no one could tell me about it. Like the special service garage, Peter Gillitzer was all over that. He didn't know anything about it. Even Wayne Draper, like the stylist who worked at Ford Australia, absolute petrolhead, couldn't tell me anything about where that car was built. So it was this gigantic mystery, which we finally managed to solve. And I feel like I was almost destined to do that interview because it wasn't long after I spoke to Bill Bourke that he sadly passed away. So, just the timing of getting AMC up and running, the timing of deciding to do the story on the Bill Bourke special at that time, the timing just getting in there to talk to Bill before he passed away, it was just amazingly fortuitous, Good luck was definitely shining on me there through that process because it was not only a great achievement journalistically, but it was also from memory. I think it was the strongest selling issue of the 53 that I did. So
that
it was well worth the effort. Yeah, it was fantastic.
The story on the GDHO, I think from memory, was 32 pages long, which goes to show that people who read this magazine actually read magazines. They don't read headlines and captions.
No, that's right.
Give us a little bit of the background of that story, because that's got to be the most detailed history story on any car.
The Phase 4, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that was, again, that's one of those stories. Like, there were bits and pieces on it as I was growing up. Bits a little bit here. They said that 3 had been put aside for preparation for racing, and 1 had gone down the production line before the program was cancelled. That's about all I knew. And through the association with the magazine, I got to know David Bowden, who owns that wonderful collection up in Queensland of Australia's, the most famous and priceless competition muscle cars. And he had a wealth of information. He'd been following the Phase 4s pretty much from the time they were released and the program was shut down. So through that, I was able to establish some fantastic information on what the cars were, how much preparation was done, all sorts of insider information. And it was just so important because there'd been, again, a lot of misinformation, a lot of urban myths about these cars, and just to be able to nail them down. This one, the 3 cars that were photographed in Ford Special Vehicles being prepared for racing. And then, of course, the production one, the single one that went down the line, to be able to tell that story in that depth was immensely satisfying. And equally satisfying was people coming up, like, even V8 supercar drivers at the time saying, "Mate, I read that thing on the Phase 4. That was fantastic. Just hanging on every word. I had no idea. I didn't know." So the satisfaction I got from doing that magazine was just not really a teacher, but just an educational role in expanding people's knowledge. The people coming up and saying, "I had no idea." That was quite often the comment. "I had no idea that this happened," or "I had no idea that car existed." And for people to keep coming up and saying that, you knew you were educating a very passionate market. And if they walked away knowing more about it than when they started, then it was job done. It was great.
I would say that Luke, who followed you into the chair, and then Steve, what do you two gentlemen, what do you get out of that sort of a story in context of looking back at what Mark did then and what you have done in the same sort of story areas? Mark certainly set a benchmark for you.
Yeah, it was a case of take the story to the next level if you could. When you have stories where Mark Oastler has done 40 pages on a particular topic, it's difficult to take it to the next level, but you find the area to explore that's the sidebar and you run with it. And thankfully you do have change of ownerships of cars, and you have stories that Mark did that those cars were restored, and then I could do the yarn on the restoration, for instance, or suddenly an old race car that was a GDHO would pop up and we could authenticate it. And so there was a story. So, yeah, it was a case of Mark laying the foundation and then we building upon it.
Yeah, I'd probably echo that. I recently had to honour the 50th anniversary of the supercar scare. So Mark's done it beautifully in the past. So it's a question of, where do we go with new information? So it's a very difficult job to try and come up with more rather than just rehashing. And personally, I think we did a good job on it. But back to the telling of the stories originally, for myself as a reader back then, it was so fantastic to read the stories of those cars and that history, which hadn't really been told in really any kind of depth. It was very superficial, as everything that we knew about the Phase 4, the XU1 V8, the episodes with Chrysler, with the V8 version. All of that stuff was really, it was history that had happened, and the supercar scare itself. You couldn't make that up as an episode, as an episode in Australian history. It's just astonishing what happened. But it was just I think that was one of the great strengths of the magazine right from the beginning, was that the fact that you dug right down deep and told those stories, which people, we all as muscle car and motorsport fans, or just car people, were dying to read.
I think the difference too is two things. You guys, Luke and Steve, your follow-up in terms of your time in the chair, I'm not just this peeing in your pockets. So you've done an excellent job at following up. There's so many times I've read an article that you've done, where I thought that is a really clever angle. It's a fresh angle. It's something that I wouldn't have thought of or didn't do. So you've both put your individual stamps on the magazine without swaying away from the core value. And so I'm proud of the work that both Luke and Steve have done in following me up, because it's not like, oh wow, the magazine's in a downward spiral. You guys really get it, and you're maintaining the standard that we wanted to set from issue one. So well done to both of you.
Thank you, Mark. I've got to say that the readers kept us in line, and I think you probably concur, Steve, that any time you repeated something and you didn't have more to offer, you would get letters, you'd get hate email. And the readers demanded new storytelling and new stories, and you had to find them. And they were actually open to, in my case, we did a lot of stories on the non-traditional Ford and Holden touring cars. So I'm talking about the BMW 635, and I mean, that sold really well with the JPS cars. And you brought in Gricey and Frank Gardner to soften the blow for those people that were offended. And some people were offended that a German BMW or a
six-cylinder BMW.
That's right. But for the most part, the readership welcomed it. We didn't see a dip in sales when we diverted from traditional Australian muscle cars.
Yeah, but I think that's the natural evolution of the magazine. If I had stayed there beyond my tenure, that I would have gone, I would have done all the Group C stuff, like, the turbocharged Bluebirds, the RX-7s, the BMWs, as you did. All of those cars are worthy of fitting under that masthead, because you might remember the little subheading that we came up with for issue one, the heritage of homegrown high performance. And that is a really broad umbrella. If you look at it, it doesn't just have to be, the quintessential Australian muscle cars. As I said, there's so many layers, there's so many ripples in the pond that go further and further out, which are all very much worthy of being included under that masthead. So I think it's fantastic that the readership has gone with you. I mean, I know what you mean about the readership. They were so demanding when we launched issue one. That was a bit of a scattergun approach, because I'd just come out of Street Machine magazine about 2 years before, so I still had this sort of modified car kind of Street Machine thing in my head, and I was thinking, in that first issue, I just tried a few different things, put a modified car in there. I think there was a technical thing about fitting a 6-speed gearbox to a Commodore or something. I can't remember, but it was a whole lot of different things. And just as soon as that magazine came out, the feedback started coming in. No, don't want that. We don't want that. We don't want that. We want this. And the readership, when they nominated this, was what very, very quickly shaped the editorial for that magazine on the way to go. I could see what they wanted was very much what I wanted to do. So it was so good to be able to clear that those other articles away and just focus on that core subject. And that's what made the magazine so pure editorial, I guess, because you picked it up and you knew exactly what you were going to get every time you opened it.
It's kind of like the definition of a magazine, which is that the editorial team starts each issue with, let's say, 100 pages of blank paper, and you have to put onto those 100 pages of blank paper something new and interesting, but looks and feels like all of the issues that have gone before, but it's totally new itself.
Exactly. Yeah, the reader has to know what they're going to get. So it has to be fresh, but it has to be, loyal to that original message.
It has to be in a comfort zone.
I just don't think it's never wavered. Like, it hasn't gone, it's stuck to that core value, largely as a result of Luke and Steve thinking outside the square, because, the stuff I did when we were opening up, I mean, that was what you might call low-hanging fruit by today's standards, because it was like, who knows about Phase 4? Who knows about the Super Falcons? XU1 V8 RT chargers, all this stuff no one had ever written about. So that was just brilliant. It was just really exciting and really new, fresh material. So I reckon Luke and Steve have had a harder job than me in a way, following along and trying to milk a different angle from a lot of these topics. So, it really has. The success of the magazine has been, amongst the three of us, without a doubt. We've all put in a very significant contribution.
I'm going to change the subject for a second. Let's move across to something else that the magazine has done in cooperation with others. Do you remember a little event that we cobbled together called Australian Muscle Car Masters at Eastern Creek?
Oh, yeah. Mm.
Yes, that was something that I think I think there's probably somewhere in the region of 200 or 300 people who claim to have invented that idea. Most of them being, cleverly involved in motor racing at some level or another.
Yes.
We started that as a cooperative venture with the Australian Racing Drivers Club, who run Eastern Creek, which is now called Sydney Motorsport Park. What are your memories? Again, let's cross-reference our memories as to how that started and how much fun it was to do something that nobody else had done before. In the same way the magazine was, the event was like nothing that Australia had ever seen before.
Well, I must admit, Bergie, it was your idea. I remember being in there when we were still at the office in Hornsby there, and I remember you coming to me and saying, "We need an event." What do you mean we need an event? He said, we need an event that we can put our name to, that is part of the magazine and lives and breathes what we do. And I thought, okay. And I said, what kind of event? And then Bergie, to his credit, said, well, what do you want it to be? And that was just like letting a kid loose in a lolly store, honestly. So I drafted up some ideas that I really, really wanted to see in an event that would not only stamp it as uniquely Australian muscle car, but would just provide so many opportunities to things that I just wanted to see at a racetrack. What I was really, really passionate about was the fact that there were so many of these old race cars sitting around the place. You'd quite often see them displayed at indoor car shows and things like this. But I was getting really, really frustrated because you'd walk around and you say, they're not doing anything. Like these are race cars. They've got loud barking exhaust. They've got fantastic sounds. They rock and roll and they slide. And you just cannot see that with that sitting in a static show. And where it really struck me one day, I went to one of these air shows and I was walking around amongst all these historic aircraft and they were flying. They were flying past and you could hear the sounds and just these magnificent sights and sounds of historic aircraft in the air. I said, that's it. We've got to liberate these cars. We've got to find some way to get all these old race cars back on the track so people can see and hear them. And that was the idea behind what we called the Master Blast. We came up with the idea of Muscle Car Masters, but then the subcategories below that in terms of the entertainment on the day, beyond historic touring car categories, which were fabulous, we included something called Master Blasts, you might remember, and Heritage Hot Laps. And these allowed these priceless competition muscle cars, many from the Bowden collection in Queensland, to be driven around Eastern Creek at close to race speeds without actually being in a race. So for people, that was just gold. You can imagine what it was like for an enthusiast to see Brockie's 1979 Bathurst winning A9X howling down the straight, Pete Gagan's Mustang, and Beachy's Monara, Moffat's Mustang. I mean, these cars, legendary cars, which until we did Muscle Car Masters were just basically static exhibits. That's all you ever saw. These things were running, they were firing, and people were just so intoxicated by what they saw. It hadn't happened before. And the Muscle Car Masters established that. And that was one of my, the proudest moments to see that event get up and running.
It was, I mean, for the first few years of Masters on Father's Day every year, it was absolutely spectacular. The crowds were enormous. The crowds were just staggeringly big.
Oh,
and
enormous crowds. And, yeah.
It was just fun to be around.
And you know what I also loved, Bergie, was just while we're on that, the inviting many of the great drivers of the past, to enjoy that VIP status, to sign autographs for the fans during signing sessions. And in some cases, like John Goss, Kevin Bartlett, so many of these, John Harvey, these great drivers of the past guest drove the cars that made them famous in those Master Blast and Heritage Hot Lap sessions. So, it was just overload for a racing enthusiast, and people just absolutely, loved that event. I would have to say the highlight for me was the 2008 where we had the Fantastic Five on display. We got them all together, the kings of that golden improved production touring car period of the early 1970s. Yeah, so we had Moffat's Mustang, Bob Jane's Camaro, Norm Beachy's Monaro, Gagan's Super Falcon, and his 67 Mustang, all together in the one place. I'll never forget the hush. That was extraordinary. When we got them all lined up, there was like this sort of, like the crowd was in reverence to these cars. There was just like this respectful, almost silence when they were all lined up.
And
just
then they
people weren't
started
saying very much. Yes, so they weren't saying very much. And then, boom, the five of them started up. And, I've just got so many fond memories of that. That was a magic moment, to get those five cars together. I really, that was the peak of Muscle Car Masters for me. Just that moment, it was amazing.
I'll give you one last question before I change over to discussing this whole thing again with Luke. Which was your favourite issue and which was your worst?
Oh, I think we've covered those too. It's would have to be the Bill Bourke special was my favourite issue for the reasons I've given. Just the incredibly fortuitous timing to talk to such a legend of the Australian car industry before his untimely passing. That would always have to be my finest moment as editor, I think. And even though I don't regret doing the Holden Overlander, that would be my least popular magazine. But that's okay because I was prepared to wear that at the time. I thought it would be controversial. We may have taken a dip when we did, but I'm really glad that got out there because there was a lot of stuff that people didn't see as a result of running that story. I was contacted by a lot of former owners of those cars because there weren't very many made. They're incredibly rare. Only like 100, 110, 120 cars were produced. They created a Facebook group where all the owners who didn't have a club or anything, they all started getting together and doing a lot of activities together. And so, I think it served a purpose, and it certainly stretched the AMC's readership understanding of the depth of knowledge that we had there. So, yeah, they'd be the best and the not so best.
Well, Mark, it's I've always enjoyed talking to you. You're going to stay on the line and kibitz while we discuss the following years with editors numbers 2 and 3. So, Mark Oastler, founding editor number 1. Thank you so much for your time today. But stay on the line because there's more to come. I'm going to switch over now and talk to editor number 2, Luke West, who took over from you on edition number 54. What was it like when you were first given the opportunity or even the suggestion that you might take over in Mark's chair as a contributor at that stage of the game? What did you feel like?
Well, it was too good an opportunity to pass up where I was in my career. I've always aspired to be a magazine editor, a motoring magazine editor. And so I couldn't turn down the opportunity, but OMG, what a hard act to follow for the reasons that Marco pointed out. You could pick any of those first 30, 35, 40 issues. And I remember looking at issue 20 where Mark Oastler had done 40 pages on the RPO 83 Falcons in 1973 and going, how am I going to top that? And I got to tell you a funny story when it became known that I was the poor sucker taking over and in charge of continuing Mark's legacy. I walked into the media centre at the Clipsal 500, so this was March 2011, and Mark Fogarty spotted me. And he came up to me and without any pleasantries, no hellos, no congratulations on your new role, he just glared at me, pointed his finger at me and said, "Don't stuff it up," and walked away. Okay, folks.
Oh, no pressure.
No pressure whatsoever. So, folks, if you're listening, I hope I didn't stuff it up. It's still going, so hopefully I did a half-decent job.
Yes, it's a funny thing. I mean,
I'm sorry, Bergie, just on that, just what Luke's saying, just as a little aside there, when I put it to him to take over as editor, we used to meet once a year up at the Hornsby Cafe there, and Luke would sit down with his whole list of stories that he wanted to contribute. And there were quite an extensive list of stories, and they were also really, really good story ideas. And I can remember looking at this guy thinking, I'm just going to put that one in the back pocket, because when I do eventually move on, I reckon he's potentially a new editor. And he continually impressed me each year with all these story ideas that he came up with. And I said, no, he's the guy. So I'm not surprised that he did well.
Yes, he certainly did well. I mean, the thing is, as you say, it's like fear and trepidation of taking over somebody's role who has done such a stellar job. You know, that's a little nudge to you, Mark. But you know, it must have been quite daunting. And when we get round to talking to Steve in a few moments, I'm going to ask him exactly the same question. But Luke, the sort of fitting in, you'd been a contributor for quite a long time. So it couldn't have been all that difficult, because you'd already had all these ideas, and now it was your opportunity to put that into play.
Yeah, I guess probably the ideas and the creative side was my strength, and also motorsport history. My weakness was the technical side. So I figured that Mark in 54 issues had covered a lot of the technical stuff. It wasn't my thing. I was determined to find a good technical story writer, and the boys will tell you here that they are as rare as unicorns. So there are people who can write technically, but not in an entertaining fashion and tell a story and captivate the audience. So I had to work to my strength, which was, I thought, as a motorsport historian. And I brought a lot more of the personalities into the magazine, so the drivers of the muscle cars. And so we went down that path. And as I said, you just got to find the angle to work with. So if Mark had done 35 pages to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the A9X, so when it came up in my time to do the 40th anniversary, you just had to look at what he did, tell the basics of that story, take it in another direction. So what helped me, I thought, took the pressure off me from the management's point of view. At that stage, Ray, you had sold Chevron Publishing to Next Media. And so they were very, Bruce and David, the head honchos at that stage of Next Media, were very concerned that the magazine would fall flat when Mark Oastler went on to other things. So my second issue turned out to be a stroke of good fortune. I did the cars of Mad Max. So I did 40 pages on tracking them down where I could, telling the story of their creation. And I'm really pleased to say that, as I understand it, my second issue, the Mad Max issue 55, was the biggest selling AMC edition of all time. Now, issue number 1 would have been if you had more copies out there, but because I guess it was a bit of a conservative print run in those days, and probably the same for the first few issues. But this is just from the figures that I saw. So that took the pressure off from the second issue to be really strong sales-wise. That they then left me alone, basically. They said, all right, get it out on time. Make sure it sells. Don't get sued by anyone, but just go and do it. Okay.
It's interesting you say that, because casting back in memory, you're quite right. The first 4 issues of the magazine, because they were quarterlies, they sold extremely well on relatively modest print runs. Very, very good from our point of view. But once we got into the second year of publishing, we upped our ante to 6 issues a year, so it became a bi-monthly. And about 2 issues into that, we had the brilliant idea of doing a reprint on the first 4 issues. And those magazines were only available by purchasing them from us directly by direct mail. We printed 10,000 copies of each of the magazines. We charged $10 a copy plus postage and handling, and sold out in about 3 months of all 4 issues.
Yeah.
So we printed an extra 40,000 magazines and sold the lot. And
I remember.
When was the last time you heard that happen?
I remember one of the key things with that, Bergie, I remember being very insistent about, because so many people have said, I missed issue 1, I missed issue 3, whatever, yet we're happy to reprint them. But you must, on the barcode, put the wording, collector's reprint, because the people who had bought the original copies were so proud of the fact they had the originals. We didn't want to burn them by just putting out more and more of the same. So I remember those reprints had collector's reprint on them, and that was really good, because the readership, our original readership, were very supportive of that, very appreciative of that.
Yeah, that's very true. Getting back to you, Luke, you just mentioned the Mad Max issue. Would that be your favourite? I'm assuming it would be, because you've produced an awful lot of issues. You've produced, around about 40 issues, roughly?
55.
No, more than that.
55. Okay,
55,
right.
yeah. I was proud of that. Very proud of the 100th issue in terms of the contents. Proud to get to 100 issues was a very daunting thing when I first walked in the doors here, and in particular in that 100th issue, we finally secured an interview with Norm Beachy. I've been plugging away at Norm for 8 years. 7 or 8 years, and he kept knocking me back. So I was determined to find a way to make it happen, and I found that way. If anyone knows or has met John Smales, you know he's a man who loves a challenge and won't take no for an answer as a journalist. So I was chatting to John at some stage, and funnily enough, both Mark and myself worked for John at the Project Group, his marketing agency that had Toyota and BHP as the major clients. How about that for a lineup? And I put it to John, and he said, "Leave it with me, Luke." And sure enough, the only person that Norm Beachy would be interviewed with to reminisce, to be interviewed by, was John Smales. So John delivered in spades. So thank you very much for that. We also, in that issue 100, we replicated the famous, iconic cover of issue 1, which had the classic muscle cars. We did it with the modern muscle cars. So that worked really well. We had an Al Turner feature in that. We knocked on Mark Oastler's door and asked him to reminisce about getting the magazine off the ground like we did with you. And it was also, I felt it was really satisfying to show the readership that there's life in the old dog yet. Not necessarily the editor, but the magazine. And we followed issue 100 up with another really successful one, which was Kingsley Hibbard's Phase 3 Falcon, which was the car that had all the Pantone of being left in a garage for 44 years or something like that. Was pulled off the racetrack in 1972 and pulled out of that garage 40 years later with 40 years of dust, rust, mice, you name it, spider webs. And we did the story, and that was a story that had not been told, about a very colourful character in Kingsley Hibbard and a car which was a GDHO Falcon Phase 3, a genuine one, built or rebuilt to improve production levels. So, improved touring car rules of the Australian Touring Car Championship circa 72. And it had a great story behind it, because when he picked it up from the dealership, he took it to its first race meeting. This was as a series production car in 1971. So drove it out of the Sydney dealership, drove it down to the Sandown 250-mile race, and led police a merry dance on the Hume Highway. And was arrested. They pulled him over. So it was a car that just had so many elements to its story over the years, and the ultimate element was that it was stored away and popped back up, and no one knew its story, or very few people knew the story, so we were able to tell that yarn. So that was really satisfying too. And one more, if I could, of
Please
my
do.
favourite issues was this came back, it's topical at the moment, was the big banger issue. Which car is 05 from 84 and which car is 25? That was a leap of faith for me as an editor to tackle that ground, because there were many Brock insiders that were adamant, without going into the full story of which car was which. We did a forensic on the car that was up at the museum, matched it up with photos, Ray, that you had taken in the passenger seat of 05 before the race in 1984. So we did the forensic. We matched up welds on the roll cage. We matched up paintwork that was added to the dash and the gauges. And through that and many other means, we were able to determine that the car in the National Motor Racing Museum up at Bathurst was 05, and the car that Peter Champion owned, which he genuinely believed was car 05 and had been told that by Peter Brock and others, he actually had 25. And that car now, the ex-Peter Champion car, is in the hands of the Bowden family, and only in the last couple of months they've announced that they are putting that car back to car 25. So we have clarity, and that was vindication. And it was not, I know, Mark, you tackled this subject, but you tackled the subject at the time that Peter Brock was still alive, so you had a very difficult task. You presented all the evidence and left it up to the readers to decide, where we came in and said, no, we believe the car in the museum at Bathurst is 05, Peter Champion's car is 25. So we went, I really stuck my neck out there. But I could do that because Peter Brock had passed by that stage.
It's an interesting exercise.
No, it was. That was an outstanding bit of journalistic investigation. I was just so impressed when I saw how thoroughly you presented that case with photographic evidence. It was like, yep, he's done it.
Yeah, Aaron Noonan and myself, it was a big undertaking from both of us, and Chris Currie, who's the long-term art director and still the art director today for Australian Muscle Car. He did some magnificent visual storytelling by organising the photography to match up those pics of the welds, new and old. So, so there's a wider team behind. The editor gets the glory, and also the editor gets the kick in the pants when things go wrong, and they do go wrong. You get things wrong, but there's a wider team that really put this magazine together.
Mark, you might remember the story. It's a little bit apocryphalic, but I do believe it's true, that in late 1984, when the Group C cars had finished their racing career and the rules were changing for 85, Holden decided to present the National Motor Racing Museum at Bathurst with car 05 from at the 84 Bathurst race. And when it arrived on a trailer from the Holden racing team in Melbourne, or Holden dealer team still at that stage.
Dealer team, yeah.
It wasn't quite as originally raced. Do you remember that?
Yes. Again, this was all a lot of rumour and innuendo surrounding those Dayglow cars, which was a shame because Luke would readily identify, and Steve, just how much rumour and innuendo and urban myth surrounded those two cars. So I was aware that what the museum got wasn't as raced in the 1984 Bathurst 1000. But yeah, it was just unfortunate, the shroud of uncertainty over those two cars that lasted for so long. I was sort of aware. See, I went over to the UK on a working holiday in 1985, and I think by that stage John Cleland had purchased the 25 car and was running it in a category of I think it was called Thunder Saloons or whatever, and I clearly remember that was car 25 when I was over there. So to come back and be confronted with this debate over which car was which included a very strong phone call from Peter Brock, adamant that what he was saying was correct, put me in a very, very difficult situation, as Luke has identified. So it was good that down the track, the identities were proven beyond doubt, which was great work on AMC's part.
Yes, it's one of those stories which it's almost a sort of a flag of honour to have got it right. When everybody else had just talked about it.
Absolutely. No, very good. Another proud moment for AMC, without a doubt.
They weren't all proud moments, I've got to say, Ray. I think you're going to ask me about my worst-selling issue.
Have a go.
Oh, yeah, what was that? I'm interested. What was your worst-selling issue? This is fun.
I learnt that you should not deviate from putting a glamorous race car on the cover. Don't get too creative and ahead of yourself. For instance, don't put a wolf's head with a sheep's coat on the cover. We came up with the concept of doing an issue on the wolves in sheep's clothing. So Australian-built cars that look like sheep but went like wolves. And the quality of the stories we justified. Like there was a Magna six-cylinder, and I don't remember the exact specs of that, but it actually went like the clappers. And but do you put a Magna on the cover of the Australian muscle car and expect it to sell? No. And there was 3 or 4 other cars. There was a Holden, there was a Ford, there was a Mitsubishi, and whatever the other ones were, I can't remember now. But so all right, okay, let's come up with something creative. We'll put a wolf's head on it, and yeah, that was a rare time when we had a dip in sales for an issue. I've got to say the opposite was true also. You really got a spike in sales because, and I find the team would put their heart and soul into an issue and you'd go, this is going to sell so many more, thousands more, but sales didn't fluctuate. But that was a good thing. It was such a loyal readership that you didn't get the peaks and the troughs very often. Yep. It would just always sell bang on what you thought it would sell, or bang on the average. Didn't deviate by more than 1,000 or 2 at a time. So that was good. I also, one of the other things I would change from my time is that we did an issue in 2016. We love an anniversary at Australian Muscle Car, particularly a 50th anniversary. So we looked at the cars that predated the start of the muscle car era. So the cars of 1966. We did a 66 clickety-click, to use the bingo phrase, as the main cover line, and lots of 1966 stories within the mag. But the cursive font that we put on the cover for Clickety Click had people doing a double take. The C and the L in Click blended together to look more like a D. So Clickety Click was more like clickety, words starting with D and ending with ick, if you get the idea. And the only further to that, I've got to say, when I started my 9-year stint with Muscle Car in-house, I had a series of stories I wanted to do. Norm Beachy interview was one of them, lots of other things. I pretty much ticked off the list, but I'm ticked off that I wasn't able to bring to life in my time as editor, and it sticks in my craw today. I gave myself the task of trying to find the 1968 Hardy Ferodo 500 winning Monaro, the GDS 327 of Bruce McPhee and Barry Mulholland. I thought I had a pretty good lead on tracking it down in my early days, and I thought, this will be a slow burn, but I'll get this. And I had a very knowledgeable Holden enthusiast and historian on side, and I thought we were going to bring that to life, but ultimately I couldn't get it over the line, couldn't find the car, couldn't track it down. And today it could well be that car is still sitting away, rusting away on a farm. And for the treasure hunters out there, I can narrow it down for you. I am 99% sure, so get your pens and paper out. I'm going to give you the location now and you can go looking for it. it's somewhere in regional Western Australia. So that narrows it down for you, doesn't it?
Yes, it's only
very
about
small
the size of about 3 European countries.
Yeah,
That's right,
yeah.
exactly. No problem at all. Okay. Look, that's, I mean, that's interview number 2. Fantastic, great stories, wonderful. I'm now going to sort of slide sideways across and talk to Steve Normoyle, who is the current editor of the magazine. You took over from Luke on what issue now, Steve?
I'm not really sure. I think it was
108 or 109?
Well, it was a gradual transition, so I think it might have been 111 or 12, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Because I had after 8 or 9 years, sorry to steal your time here, Steve, but just to set the scene, I reached the point where I'm going, I don't know that I have too many more ideas. I think it's, I was there for about 9 years. I followed a bloke who was there for 9 years. I think you need new blood at the helm, and you need new creative ideas, which, that Steve has certainly brought to the table. So I had a bit of a phase-out period where I was editor-at-large for 6 months as I sort of looked for the next thing I was going to do. So Next Meter were really good to me to allow me to be editor-at-large till I took a communications job that turned into an absolute disaster. But that's another story and not really on topic here. So, yeah, I was working with Steve for 6 months or even 12 months, maybe, Steve, as a transition. To give you a hand, because I was lucky to have Steve as a writer and as effectively my deputy editor. So we kind of switched roles there for 12 months.
Yeah, because Steve, you've been with Chevron Publishing for a very long time.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of the unusual part of it, because I've literally been there from the beginning. Well, not the beginning of Chevron, but certainly even before the magazine existed, because I was the editor of Racing Car News when it died, and then I went on to we did Motor Racing Australia for many years. So so I was there for the whole way. And you're talking about Luke talking about the 05 versus 25 story. I mean, I was sitting in the chair just across from you, and I saw the pain that you went through that process, and it was painful. But that was a great story to have done, and it was a great story for the magazine, because, I mean, as we've spoken before, it's one of those things that, I mean, that car, the last of the big bangers, the Bathurst winner, talking about the 05, for Holden fans, it's almost like a holy car. So it's a very important car, and for it to have doubt as to which one it is, largely created by Peter Brock himself, has always been something that's been a real issue for people. But you went and solved it, and I did see the difficulties that were involved with that went down with that. So it was good work. But I digress. I'm off the topic. What was the question, Ray?
just well, as Luke just said a moment ago, there was a sort of not a sort of a clear-cut issue changeover. Mark finished on one issue, Luke started on the next issue. The two of you worked in a collaboration sense for a number of issues, whilst Luke and you sort of gradually changed seats. But
because what happened was that I ended up. Next Media had the rights to F1 Australia, so I was editing that. Was under license. And then they lost that. I can't remember what the dates were, but so they lost that. So then it was a case of, well, what do they do with me? So you were only sort of just hanging around. I mean, you had one little job each year, which was to write a 256-page book on the Great Race at Bathurst. Well, there was that, yeah. But yes. That's something that we used to just throw together at the last minute. Yeah. Nothing like writing 100,000 words in a month. but that was some time earlier. But that was when I took over that from the late great Bill Tuckey. I think Andrew Clark was involved with it in the interim, but Tuckey's the guy that made the book famous because, in a sense, that's sort of it's iconic as this magazine is in a way. I guess it's sort of a past thing now, but yeah, I came up with a brilliant idea at the end of 1991 that why don't we get this thing out for Christmas instead of out for the following year? And you all said, yeah, it's a good idea. So
all we had to do was find a printer who could actually
there went
produce.
my weekends for the rest of October and November
Exactly.
each year. What a good idea that was.
It was absolutely excellent. I can remember the joy of having literally pallet loads of books arrive on your front doorstep almost at Christmas, and you had thousands of copies that had been ordered by people, and you had to actually package them and post them so that they got to their destination before Christmas Eve. And sometimes we had like 5 days to do it in. It was just buckets of fun. It was just fantastic.
But that's off topic.
Just a little.
But yeah, so I was doing F1 racing, and then that was gone. So it was a question of what to do with me: sack me, find another role. So
were you considered as editor of Gardening Australia?
you wouldn't want to do that. So anyway, yeah. So I ended up taking sort of more of a role, and we still had some other publications here that I had to do. So my time was split between one shots, various event programs that we were still doing, and helping Luke. So yeah, I was sort of, I suppose, editorial assistant, and that was, I mean, yes, I had been an editor before, so I was well versed with what was involved with just the nuts and bolts of doing magazines. But it was really good to work under Luke and learn. I mean, obviously, I knew what the magazine was, and I understood that, but just to learn from a different way of doing things, because the way that Luke does things is quite different from me, and it was a really good grounding to sort of look at another way of doing things. And so, okay, so yeah, I wouldn't have thought of it doing like that, but he has, and so that was really good. So it was a very, I guess it was a slow and pretty easy transition in the end, and then I think I can't remember what the years were now, but it's probably 2.5 years.
Yeah, 2019, I phased myself out, and you were always so supportive, and you had so much experience. I was a rookie editor, magazine editor, so it was always great to use you as a sounding board for ways of doing things. So it was great. It was always, we worked so well together across the whole team. And as I said, Chris Currie was the graphic designer, but more than a graphic designer.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of the time, we used to come up with what's going to be the main cover line, because you had your cover car and your cover story, and then but what's going to be the catchy cover line? And we worked on the basis that no one should be too precious if their suggested story headline or the cover line got overruled. Because you put it out there. If you write a story, you got to put a header in there. But someone else, the editor, could come up with, or the sub-editor, proofer, could come up with a better idea. And in many cases, it was the graphic designer who came up with the best idea.
And still is.
Yeah.
In fact,
the words, you wouldn't think he'd tell you I'm not a wordsmith, but
that's
quite
what he'd
often
say. Yep.
He came up with the best headlines.
Yeah, no, it's true. That is true. And I can tell you that is true with the current issue as well. So he's still doing it.
That could be frustrating for editors. Yeah.
Well, it's not frustrating for me. I think I'm the worst cover line writer in the universe. So any help I can get is greatly appreciated. But yeah, I mean, look, on the subject of artists, obviously Danny Bourke was the original artist, and he put in he worked very hard on the magazine. It was a magazine that he loved. And then Chris came on as sort of his assistant, and he trained up Chris, and Chris has taken over. But yeah, Chris is much more than just the artist. For any reader, the hours and hours that he puts in with photograph research and all that sort of stuff is just amazing. So I can tell you that with our current the current issue that we've just done, and our Bathurst magazine that we've just done. He's done a few 4 a.m.s to get everything done. So, Yeah, so he's very, very important part of it. It's not just the editor might take the glory and be blamed for everything that goes wrong, but there are other people involved.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned. Sorry, Bergie. I'm glad you mentioned Danny Bourke, because he was my founding. If I was founding editor, he was founding art director. And Danny, as Ray and Steve and everyone would know, he was just a full-on petrol head. Like, he really got it. And he just went to the nth degree with each of those issues that we did together to make it as good as he possibly could. So, very grateful to Danny Bourke, because he was a huge part of the success of that magazine, certainly during my 53 issues.
It's interesting you say that, fellas, because I can remember a very, very interesting conversation I had with Danny Bourke very early in the magazine's creation. I think it might have been the first or second issue. And he would get the story from the editor, and he would then go, that's the job of the art director, to go and find the photographs to accompany that story, to illustrate the story. And he'd come out of the archive, the photographic archive, with a story and a bunch of pictures. And he had this sort of puzzled look on his face. And I said, I asked him, is there anything wrong? And he said, look, I've been in publishing for quite some time, and I'm used to getting the story and then going to the archive and trying to find some photographs, half a dozen if I'm lucky, to illustrate the story. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I've just spent 2 or 3 hours in the archive, and I now have something north of 50 photographs to sort through to decide which ones to use. I'm not used to that. It was kind of like, I've got this gold mine, but which chunk of gold do I pick up first? And it was a thoroughly entertaining observation.
Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes if you had a hole to fill in the magazine, you might have a story that wasn't quite ready. Someone let you down, like a contributor, or just the story wasn't coming together. You'd have to just fill that space. I'd go into the photographic archive and I'd find something, and the photos would prompt the story. You go, oh, what's that car? Well, you start to investigate, and what's that scenario crash about? And you could fill gaps in the magazine by just starting with the photo and then writing some words.
Yes, it's fascinating. The photograph, the old gag, a photograph is worth 1,000 words if you find the right photograph. And the key to, one of my keys to publishing anything, books, magazines, newspapers, doesn't matter what it is, it's the caption for the photograph, because the caption has to tell you who, what, when, where, and why. Those 5 pieces of information must be in that 20 or 30 word caption to make the picture make sense. Editors, what do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. There's more. No, they're very frustrating reading articles where there's some assumed knowledge on the editor's part that you know what you're looking at, and you really don't, particularly when you get into quite intricate sort of train spotting details between different models, and there's just this stack of photos, and you go, well, I can't tell which one that is. As a reader, that's very, very frustrating. So we were right across that from the start as part of that education philosophy that we had, and it worked really well.
So, Steve, you're the current editor. You've been in the job for quite some time. You've been in the magazine since day one. What are your favourite memories of the things that went really right, and, as Luke has already fessed up to, some of the things that have gone really wrong?
I don't know. I guess if it's a 9-year time span for an editor of this magazine by the sound of it, so
you've still got a fair way to go.
I've got a bit to go yet, so maybe those haven't happened yet. I'll just have to remember to sack myself or just leave at the end of the 9 years. I don't know. It's I'm not really sure how to answer that one.
What are your preferred stories? Do you prefer race car stories or road car stories? Because basically the magazine has two halves.
Yeah,
it always has had from day one.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of more of a racing person, but when you say racing in the context of this, we're talking about homologation special road cars, really. So and I'm the same as everybody. I grew up loving the LC Trainer XU1. That's my favourite car of all time, and that's from when I was a 10-year-old. But yeah, it's for me, I guess it's I like telling the racing stories, but if we're talking about what do I enjoy doing, but I do like the road car stuff because it's not my primary specialty. So in terms of the research of trying to tell a story, so for example, we've done a fairly big thing on the Phase 4, I think in the previous issue. Now, as we've talked about, Mark did that in minute detail very early on in the magazine. So you can't match that. And I mean, that's what was great about that story for me was not just the fact that no one had covered it, but Mark was able to explain what the car was and why it would have been an absolutely superb Australian sports sedan as a comparable to anything is in the world. I mean, it was just a complete car, and obviously it's without driving the thing, but
well, these things we're talking about a car in a certain time frame.
Yes.
Right? Because you can't compare a car that was built in 1972 with a car that's built in 2022.
Oh no, it's obviously in the context of when it was new, but in 1972, in terms of performance and handling and everything that car offered, you'd be hard pressed to find anything in the world, certainly of absolutely in a 4-door sedan that didn't cost $1 million. Well, there probably wasn't any 4-door sedan in the world that would have offered that level of performance and handling and just general excitement in as a driving car. But yeah, so to revisit that and to try and delve deeply into that car and find new information on it, for me was quite rewarding because it's a topic that's been done. Yeah. I would not say to death, but it's been done in such a comprehensive way, and to then try and provide something genuinely new, or at least a genuinely new perspective, was really sort of rewarding from my point of view to be able to do it. I think I did it reasonably well, but I also learned a lot of things along the way. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to change topic just for a moment, and I'm going to start back with Mark and say, in all of the time that you were the editor, you interviewed an awful lot of people. Now you've mentioned Bill Bourke earlier, and I say I will sort of extract him from the list. But who would you nominate as your most impressive driver, personality, whatever, that you interviewed for a story in the magazine over the time you were editor? And I'm going to ask the same question to Luke and to Steve.
Boy, that is a really tough one, because if I just got out 53 issues and flicked through them, there's just so many great drivers who all had a very engaging form of conversation. So that would be very, very tough to choose. But I must say, if I would have to say the guy I admire the most out of anyone I interviewed on quite a regular basis, because he was very generous with his time, was Alan Moffat. Because as a kid, he was obviously my racing hero, and I just look at the incredible application, the professionalism, the absolute dogged determination to be the best he could throughout his career. And that came through, I think, when he spoke about important races and important cars. And I've got a lot of respect for all the great drivers, but there's just, Moffat was there from when young as I can remember. And I've always put him on a pedestal above anyone else, just the professionalism, the way he applied himself. I fancy a guy making a transition from being basically a flagship, if you like, for the Ford Motor Company for so long, driving big thundering V8 Falcons, and then making a transition to a tiny rotary-powered Mazda RX-7, and making that so successful. That campaign was just so incredibly successful. And a lot of that came down to Moffat's determination to be the best, to win. Now, he wasn't interested in second place. No matter what you gave him to race, he had to make it the best. I mean, this is what a lot of people didn't understand about Moffat. They'd say, oh, look at AM, he turns up at the racetrack a few days before the meeting. He's grinding around and around and around trying to get his eye in. That was absolute rubbish. That was Moffat's professionalism came right from his early days as a carcraft development driver in the US. He was so fanatical and so surgical about getting his car to the absolute peak of its performance. That's what he was doing, grinding around there. He was trying a million different setups, a million different sway bars, springs, shocks, tyres, roll centres, everything. He was just working his way through this so methodically to make sure that car was as good as he could possibly make it for the race. I don't remember seeing anyone in Australian motorsport applying themselves to that level. And it was that where my respect for the guy was always just put him, one notch above anyone else. So I'd have to say, in terms of engagement in interviews and getting out of him what I needed for the story, I'd have to put Moffat right up there. He's just one of a kind.
Yeah, I concur with that one, Mark. In fact, I would put Alan forward as the most fascinating character that I interviewed. I've got to say, for the first couple of years until he got to know me and I got to know him, he was really difficult to deal with. And then once he came to trust me and see me as someone who wasn't out to stitch him up, I found him really easy after about 2 or 3 years to work with, and so warm and engaging and just very different to the Alan Moffat that I encountered the first year or so that I was in the job.
It's interesting you say that, Luke, because it was Wayne Webster who came up with the Alan and Arthur joke, because we always used to say that Alan was so intense at a race meeting. You never knew when you walked into the garage whether it was going to be Alan or Alan's alter ego, Arthur, because Arthur was the guy who was absolutely charming, absolutely wonderful guy, would talk the leg off an iron pot. He was a wonderful human being, but he was never at the racetrack. That was always Alan.
Yes.
Yeah, he was certainly a character. I can't say that I ever really got to know Alan particularly well. I certainly had some run-ins with him during the Bathurst book period. But yeah, look, I mean, what an amazing guy. If you look at everything that Mark was saying, he was a very different personality, and he was probably, you'd have to say, the opposite of someone like Peter Brock, who was personable and everyone's mate. So there was always a lot of talk about Moffat. He was criticised. Oh, look, he's not a natural driver. He has to work at it. And I mean, I think it's such a throwaway line, and I think you've really just got to look at the results. Well, he got results, and I mean, what can you say? He was a great driver, and the level of detail that he went to in terms of preparation, tuning of the car at the track, and his general professionalism with putting together the deals and the sponsorships and everything else, quite apart from the way that he played up to the crowd, to sort of, I guess that was all part of his appeal. Is you either you'd be at the track with. I remember being at Oran Park early 70s or mid 70s really, and Moffat was the guy. Moffat's car comes out onto the track, and it's almost like a hush. It's almost as though half the crowd loves him and the other half hates him. You couldn't be indifferent, and he helped to cultivate that. Just with, I'm sure it was a conscious thing, but yeah, I think he was in lots of ways ahead of his time with the way that he did things, and just an amazing guy.
It's interesting you say, I think all three of you have said the same thing about the same person in the broad sense of the word. But I have a clear memory in the period when Alan first imported the Mustang from America when Ford had given him one of those wonderful Trans Am cars. And at that stage of the game, Alan employed as his public relations manager a chap by the name of Don Gibb. And Don was extremely clever because Alan had been racing Lotus Cortinas for quite some time, both in Australia and in America. And he was really, really good. He was bringing out a new motor car. Other Australian drivers, Bob Jane, Pete Gagan, they had Mustangs, they had Camaros. He was the latest kid on the block with a big car. And Don Gibbs said, when you look at the market, you've got Pete Gagan, bloke with a white hat. Bob Jane, bloke with a white hat. Brian Thompson, bloke with a white hat. Norm Beachy, bloke with a white hat. You've got to be the guy with the black hat. You've got to be the guy that people love to hate.
Did Bob Jane really have
a
white hat?
That's a question. But, I mean, it was a conscious effort to put one of the most charming, nicest guys into the marketplace as the anti-hero. And he actually, I'm sure that he didn't like that personally. But that was what put him aside from all the rest. And economically, it proved to be a brilliant step. So, look, I think it's about time we wound this up, but I'm going to say to Steve, one last question for you as the current editor. Where do you see the magazine going from now? Do you see it being able to continue for many more years, finding new stories, finding things that haven't been written about before? Because, as the Americans use the term barn finds, there's got to be a lot of cars out there from our era that are still under a tarp or just under dust. And there must be more stories about drivers who haven't been covered before. The magazine still, I hope, has a long and fruitful career in front of it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're in an unusual situation now where, and I think it's probably something that none of us would have ever foreseen with the local manufacturing industry completely disappearing, the Holden name gone. It's certainly a very different sort of automotive landscape from the one that we had when the magazine began. But no, I think it's really remarkable. It's a bit like what Luke was saying before about with the Kingsley Hibbard car. You know, it's surprising the amount of you used the word barn finds before. The amount of that sort of thing that still happens. You think that phase 3, the Hibbard car, it was like a time capsule. These things still pop up. There's lots of ideas. There's lots of things that we can cover, and lots of things that we can still cover. And of course we're rolling into the 2000s, which is now sort of, I guess, it's muscle car history, and I really see the 2000s for me as an absolute golden period of Australian muscle cars, because once Holden moved on from the Holden V8, the 5-litre engine, to the LS series, LS1 originally, the aluminium block 5.7 to the various incarnations that went on from there, and Ford's various responses to that during that decade. To me, that was a really golden period of muscle car. It's something that personally I would never have seen it coming. I thought back in the late 80s that probably by 1995 there won't be any V8s at all. So it's remarkable what did happen. At the moment we've only got the Ford Mustang as a V8, but yeah, there are plenty of stories still to tell.
I've got to ask one final question, which is completely out of left field. I'll ask you first, Mark, and then Luke, and then Steve, or you can all just join in. Why did we not have a Leyland P76 V8 as a muscle car?
It's on the cover next issue.
I think we covered it early in the early issues. I certainly did a piece on the proposed Force 7V as a Group C touring car. And I mean, that was that long ago. I really can't remember the details of the story, but we did interview some of the key people involved, and that generated quite a good deal of interest. But no, a P76 never made it onto the cover, I must admit, not during my 53 years.
Not as the main cover car. We did.
So this is a challenge now.
We did in my time. We photographed a 47, and it did make the cover. I'm not sure it was I don't think it was the main cover pick. It was the bottom strap. I can't remember what was the main thing on that particular issue's cover, but we did take it back out to Victoria Park, the suburb of Sydney, which is a suburb these days and used to be where they were built back in the day. And there are some relics out there and plaques in parks to highlight that was where
Leyland died.
Leyland and BMC were based and things like that. So, yeah, we tried to take, I don't know why we didn't put it as the main cover pick, because it probably would work. It certainly wouldn't have been out of place. There were 7 of those or 5 of those made.
Are we still there, Mark?
Well,
we are.
Oh, good.
There is still a chance for the P76 because we will be revisiting it. So
excellent.
So you never know.
You never know. You're like in a big city.
Not next issue.
Not next issue. One in the future. Look, gentlemen, I think this has been an absolute joy. I've thoroughly enjoyed this afternoon. I hope you have too. Mark Oastler, Luke West, Steve Normoyle, the 3 editors of the 3 musketeers kind of thing. I hope that the listening audience has enjoyed the stories, because I can tell you for a fact that a lot of these stories are being discussed for the first time out of school, as it were. So I hope we haven't frightened you too much as an audience. So once again, thank you, all 3 of you, and this is the end of today. Well, friends, that's the conclusion of another episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast series. We hope you enjoyed the tales contained herein and look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, be sure to check out musclecarmag.com.au for news stories, news and galleries from the Muscle Car Vault. We add them weekly, as well as brand new digital issues as soon as they become available on the newsstand. Thanks for listening, and as always, safe driving and happy reading from the team at Australian Muscle Car Magazine.
This edition of the AMC Premium Podcast has been brought to you by the National Motor Racing Museum, located at Murray's Corner, Mount Panorama, Bathurst, New South Wales. For more information, visit www.museumsbathurst.com.au.